In Lesson 2, we're going to start extending our knowledge of functions by talking about what it means to pass a parameter into a function and then look at how we actually do that in code. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to write a function in Python still, but you'll be able to not only write a program that uses functions, but also that uses parameters, which is a better use of functions because we can actually then give the functions information so that it can do a calculation or something for us. So as we dive in, I just want to go over the reasons that we're using this type of structured programming. So in the previous video, I talked about what is structured programming, and here I'm just going to talk through the 5 benefits of it. So the first is that it will be easier to read, and you'll see today, and then as we continue throughout the lessons, that each function will have documentation explaining its own purpose, and so we know where every single task is taking place. They're also easier to write because those programs are broken down into smaller, easier to manage functions where you solve things one small piece at a time. The third is that these programs are way easier to change, adapt, modify, and debug. If you're making an error and you repeat that error, you only need to change it in one location. Unlike previously where if we repeated code, we would have to go in and fix that error every single time. It's also much, much easier in this type of programming to determine where an error actually is. The fourth is something we've talked about a couple of times. It's easier to reuse code because it can just be copied into another program and you can reuse that same function multiple times within a program, but then can also reuse it in other programs as well. You could just copy that function and then use it elsewhere. But we can reuse code here really, really well, which is really nice. And then the other thing that's just kind of good to be aware of is that the more powerful programming language require the structure of a structured program. They require this in order to write well-written, easy to use, and understand programs. So it's just good if you plan on going into coding beyond Python for you to be exposed to this type of thinking. In Lesson 1, we talked about the following. So we talked about defining our main, all the statements that are in there, and then defining different functions and running the whole thing using this main statement. So we're going to expand off of this today. This is what we know so far. We know how to write definitions of functions with statements. We know how to call those functions. And then we know how to run the main function. So that's what we know so far. And today we're going to look at other ways that we can use functions that will make our programs better. So what leads us to this lesson are the following 2 questions. It says, if a function is its own mini program, how is information shared between different functions? What we noticed in the previous lesson is that we were only printing out a statement. We weren't actually sharing values or information. So if we're going to use these programs to perform some sort of calculation, how do we share information between the main program and the function that it's calling? The other is, how do I then get this data from one function to another? So how do we take a value that's in the main and send it to another function? How do we actually do that so that that other function can use that value? So that's what we're looking at today. How can we actually share information from the main to another function? And a parameter is how we do that. A parameter is a variable value that's passed into a function. So anything that is a parameter is something that's a value that the function needs in order to, quote unquote, do its job. So for example, if we had an area program, or if we had an area function, the area function would probably need some sort of values to help calculate the area. So we would need to pass some sort of values in so that the area function could actually do its job and could actually calculate the area. So anytime we need to pass a value in, that value is called a parameter. And we're going to look at functions that just require one parameter in this lesson, but we could actually send in multiple parameters if we want. We can send in as many parameters as we need as long as the function is defined to take in that many parameters. If no parameters are needed, like in the happy function that we saw yesterday, the parentheses are empty. So those parentheses are actually where we put our parameters. If no parameters are needed, then the parentheses are blank. So you'll see that as we actually begin to code with parameters. So here's our first example of parameter passing. So here we have the generic code for what this is going to look like. You're still going to have definition, you're still going to have 2 parentheses, and you're going to have that colon along with all of the statements indented. But where this differs is when it comes to the parameters. So you can see here that the name is whatever name you give. So here, this is a function called hello. But then here, these are all of the parameters that you need passed in. So you're basically saying, well, this is going to be a variable that I need to have passed into this program. And in this example here, the hello function needs a string with a person's name passed in. And we can do that in a variety of ways. We can just put a string when that's called, or we can actually send in a variable value that contains a string. But this is saying we need one parameter. It needs to be a string with a person's name, because in order to say hello to a person, you need to actually know who that person is that you want to say hello to. So this is an example of a program that requires a parameter. It needs a name so that they can say hello to the name of the person they enter in. Now in the previous program, to call on the happy function, you would simply write happy and have closed parentheses, because happy took in no parameters. Every time it was called, it just printed to the screen. Other types of functions that require parameters are going to have the name of that function. So on the previous example, we would have used hello. That was the name of the function. And then from here, we would send in a value that represents the parameter. So here, say for example, we had asked them for their name. So we had said, we had a variable called entered name. And we had asked the user to input their name. So what's going to happen in this code is the user is going to enter in their name. We can see that here. It's going to be saved here. Then we want to send that entered name into the function hello when it's called. So if we want that value that's been saved here to be sent in, we're going to call the hello program, and then we're going to write the word entered name, because that is holding the name of the person that I want to print to the screen. And in order to do its job, the hello function needs to have a string variable with the name I want to say hello to. So whenever we call it, you're going to see the function name, the parentheses, and then the parameters listed inside. Now, believe it or not, we've actually been using parameters for a while. Back in chapter 5, you used 3 different functions that required some sort of parameter. So the ordinal function that took in a character and spit out a number, that had a parameter of a character. And so the ordinal function, when it ran, needed that value in order to do its job. The character function needed an integer. And as a result, every time we used the character function, we had to send an integer inside of it. And then lastly, that lower function where we had to send in an actual string, I'm going to assume that this is a string variable here. And whenever we called the lower function, it took in a string value. So remember, a parameter is something that the function needs in order to do its job. To do its job, ordinal needed a character. To do its job, character needed an integer. And to do its job, lower needed an actual message to turn to lowercase. So notice that they all needed something to do their job. That value they needed is passed into them via the parameters. So what you're going to do in the video today is you're going to update the Happy Birthday program. Currently, the program sings Happy Birthday and uses that happy function in order to display that repeated line of code. Now what we're going to do today is we're going to create a function called sing. So it's going to look like this. And it's going to take in a parameter of somebody's name. And it's going to sing happy birthday to the person with that name. So it's going to take in a parameter that is a string. And then what should happen is our program should sing happy birthday to a number of people. We're going to call this sing function many times and make it sing happy birthday to multiple people. So that's what that next video is going to be about.